A homeless Navy SEAL inherited a forgotten estate. Then his dog uncovered a $120 million secret no one wanted revealed. The morning Caleb Hayes lost everything, he thought the worst was behind him. But 2 days later, a letter led him deep into the frozen forests of Maine, to a silent estate that didn't feel abandoned. His dog Coda didn't trust the front door. He found something else, something hidden. And once it opened, Caleb realized, some fortunes aren't meant to be taken. Comment 1 if you'd open that door, or 0 if you'd walk away. And tell me where you're watching from. The morning came in slow, colorless light, the kind that made the snow along the roadside look older than it was. It clung to the edges of the town like something that had been left behind, half melted, half forgotten. Caleb Hayes stood on the narrow front steps of the small rental house he had called home for 3 years, his breath steady but shallow in the cold air. A cardboard box rested at his feet. Another sat in the bed of his aging pickup truck, already tied down beneath a faded blue tarp. There weren't many. That was the part that stayed with him. 12 years in uniform, deployments across oceans, years of discipline, sacrifice. And in the end, everything he owned could fit into the back of a truck that struggled to start on the first try. Behind him, the front door stood open. Inside, the house was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that didn't belong to a place, but to the absence of a life that used to fill it. "Mr. Hayes," the landlord said from the walkway, voice careful, as if volume might make things worse. "I'm sorry it turned out like this." Caleb nodded once. He didn't look back. Sorry didn't fix anything. It didn't stop the bills. It didn't make employers call back. It didn't give a man a place to sleep when the money ran out. Sorry was just a word people used when there was nothing else left to offer. A gust of wind pushed past him, cold enough to sting the back of his neck. It carried the faint smell of wood smoke from somewhere down the street, a reminder that other homes still had warmth inside them. At the bottom of the steps, Coda stood motionless. The German shepherd's thick coat shifted slightly in the wind, black and tan fur catching the pale morning light. His ears were upright, alert, but his body was still. Too still. His eyes weren't on Caleb. They were fixed on the open doorway behind him, watching, waiting. "Coda," Caleb said softly. The dog didn't move. For a moment, the world seemed to pause with him. Cars passed at the far end of the street. A neighbor walked by with a paper cup of coffee, glancing once before looking away. Life continued, indifferent and steady. But Coda stayed where he was. Caleb stepped down onto the frozen ground, boots crunching against a thin layer of ice. He reached the dog and rested a hand along the side of his neck. Warm, solid, real. "It's done," Caleb said quietly. "We're moving." Coda turned his head then, slowly, meeting Caleb's eyes. There was no confusion there, no fear, just something deeper. Awareness, maybe, or understanding that didn't need words. Then the dog looked back at the house. Caleb followed his gaze. The third-floor window, where his lamp used to glow on winter nights, was dark now, empty, like it had already forgotten him. He tightened his grip slightly in Coda's fur, grounding himself. There was a time when Caleb Hayes had known exactly what to do in moments like this. Assess, act, move forward. That was the training. That was the mission. There was always a next step. But this wasn't a mission. There was no map, no command, no one waiting on the other side of the outcome. Just a man, a dog, and a life that had slowly come apart in ways no one else seemed to notice. "Come on," he said. This time, Coda moved. They walked together to the truck. Caleb opened the passenger door, and Coda climbed in without hesitation, turning once before settling into position, facing forward, alert, ready. Always ready. Caleb closed the door and stood there for a second longer than he needed to. His reflection stared back at him from the dusty window. broad shoulders, short cropped hair, a face that had learned how to stay still, even when everything underneath it wasn't. There was a tremor in his hands. He clenched them into fists. Not now. He walked around to the driver's side, climbed in, and slid the key into the ignition. The engine coughed once, twice, then turned over with a low, uneven rumble. Caleb rested his hands on the steering wheel. For a moment, he didn't move. The silence inside the truck was different. Smaller, closer, the kind that pressed in on a man if he let it. His eyes drifted toward the rearview mirror. The house stood there, quiet, closed, gone. He exhaled slowly. "All right," he said, more to himself than anything. "We'll figure it out." Beside him, Coda shifted slightly, leaning just enough that his shoulder pressed against Caleb's arm. Not asking, not comforting, anchoring. Caleb nodded once, almost to the dog. Then he put the truck in gear. The tires crunched over the frozen ground as they pulled away, leaving the house behind without ceremony. No goodbyes, no second look. The town passed by in pieces. Familiar streets, closed storefronts, a diner with fogged windows, a gas station where he used to stop on early mornings before work. All of it felt distant now, like something he had already left long before today. Snow lined the edges of the road as they reached the outskirts. Beyond that, the trees began, tall, dark, quiet. Coda's ears lifted slightly as the truck moved deeper into the stretch of forest road, his gaze fixed ahead. Watching. Listening. As if the world had shifted in some way Caleb couldn't see yet. Caleb kept driving. He didn't know where they were going. Not really. A friend had offered space in a barn for a few days, maybe a week. After that. He didn't let himself finish that thought. The road had curved ahead, disappearing into the trees, and for the first time since the door had closed behind him, Caleb felt it. Not fear. Not exactly. Something quieter. Something waiting. He tightened his grip on the wheel, eyes forward. Beside him, Coda didn't look away from the road, and neither of them knew yet that this morning, this cold, empty beginning, was only the first step toward something neither of them had been prepared to find. Something that had been waiting a long time, for both of them. The truck rolled deeper into the woods until the town disappeared behind a wall of bare trees and quiet distance. The road narrowed, the snow thicker here, untouched in places where tires hadn't passed in days. Caleb drove without speaking, his eyes fixed ahead, his jaw set in that familiar way that used to mean focus, but now felt more like holding something back. Beside him, Coda remained still, watching the road with the same steady attention he had carried through every patrol, every long night in places where silence meant danger instead of peace. This silence was different. It stretched longer, settled deeper. By the time they reached the edge of Ethan Cole's property, the sky had shifted to a dull gray, heavy with the promise of more snow. The barn sat just beyond a broken fence line, weathered wood leaning slightly with age, its roof patched in uneven strips of metal. Caleb killed the engine. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Coda exhaled softly. Caleb reached for the door handle and stepped out, boots crunching into packed snow. The cold hit harder here, sharper without the shelter of buildings or passing traffic. It wrapped around him, quiet and steady. "Back here," a voice called. Ethan stepped out from the side of the barn, pulling his jacket tighter around his shoulders. He was older than Caleb by a few years, broader now, with the kind of face that had softened over time but still carried the weight of old understanding. "Didn't think you'd actually take me up on it," Ethan said. Caleb nodded once. "Didn't think I'd need to." That earned a small, knowing look. Ethan didn't ask questions. That was why Caleb had come. "Place ain't much," Ethan said, gesturing toward the barn. But it's dry, and the heater works, most of the time. That's more than enough. Coda jumped down from the truck and landed quietly beside Caleb. His nose lifted slightly, taking in the scent of the place. Wood, hay, old metal, and something else beneath it. Familiar, in a way that didn't need explaining. Ethan glanced at the dog. He's still as sharp as ever? Sharper than me some days, Caleb said. Ethan nodded like that made perfect sense. Inside, the barn was colder than Caleb expected. The air carried that stillness of a place that had seen years pass without much change. Tools hung along the walls. A workbench sat cluttered in the corner. And at the far end, a small cleared space held a narrow cot, a folding chair, and a portable heater humming quietly against the cold. Caleb stepped inside, setting his bag down near the cot. "This'll do," he said. Ethan leaned against a support beam, arms crossed. "Stay as long as you need." Caleb didn't answer right away, because that question, how long, was the one he couldn't solve. "Appreciate it," he said finally. Ethan pushed off the beam. "I'll be in the house if you need anything. Food's in the fridge. Don't freeze to death out here, all right?" Caleb gave a faint nod. Then Ethan was gone, boots crunching away into the snow, leaving the barn quiet again. Too quiet. Caleb sat on the edge of the cot and let out a slow breath. His hands rested on his knees, fingers flexing once, twice. The silence pressed in. Not the peaceful kind. The other kind. The kind that waited. It started small. A distant echo, a memory brushing the edge of thought. Then louder. The sharp crack of something breaking. A voice over a radio. Static. Someone shouting his name. Caleb's head snapped up. The barn was still, empty, but his chest had tightened, breath catching halfway. Not here. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, eyes fixed on the floor as if that might anchor him. But the past didn't care where he was. It didn't care about barns or quiet towns or snow-covered roads. It came anyway. The smell of smoke that wasn't there. The sound of boots hitting dirt. The weight of something he couldn't change. His hands began to shake. Just slightly. Enough. A soft pressure touched his leg. Caleb blinked. Coda stood beside him, close enough that his shoulder pressed firmly against Caleb's knee. The dog didn't move much, didn't make a sound, just stayed there. Solid. Present. Caleb reached down, his hand finding the thick fur along Coda's neck. Warm, real, not memory, not past. Now, his breathing slowed, inch by inch, like something heavy loosening its grip. "Yeah," Caleb murmured. "I'm here." Coda didn't react to the words. He didn't need to. Caleb sat there for a long time, hand resting on the dog, listening to the heater click and hum, to the wind brushing against the walls outside. Eventually, the tension eased. Not gone, but quieter. That was enough. Night came early. By the time the last light faded, the barn had settled into a cold, dim stillness, broken only by the low glow of a single bulb overhead. Caleb ate a sandwich without tasting it, sitting at the edge of the cot, boots still on. Across from him, Coda lay near the door, not asleep. Watching. Always watching. "You could take it easy, you know," Caleb said quietly. Coda's ears shifted slightly. "That part's over." The dog didn't move. Caleb let out a faint breath that might have been a laugh once. "Yeah," he said. "Didn't think so." He leaned back against the wall, eyes drifting upward toward the rafters. The wood above him creaked softly as the temperature dropped. This wasn't a home. It was a place to stop, a place to wait. But for what? He didn't know. He closed his eyes. Sleep didn't come right away. When it did, it came in pieces. Fragments of memory. half-formed images, the kind that slipped in and out before they could settle into something solid. At some point in the night, he woke again. No sound. No reason. Just that feeling. Like something had shifted. Coda was already standing. The dog's posture had changed, subtle but clear. His head angled slightly toward the door, ears forward, body still but alert. Caleb sat up slowly. "What is it?" he asked. Coda didn't bark, didn't move toward the door. He just stood there, watching it, listening. The barn remained quiet, wind outside, nothing more. Caleb waited a few seconds, then exhaled. "Probably nothing," he said. But Coda didn't relax. Not completely. Eventually, the dog lay back down, but not as deeply as before. Not fully at rest, Caleb noticed. He always noticed, because Coda didn't do anything without reason. Caleb lay back again, staring at the ceiling. Something had changed. He couldn't explain it, couldn't name it. But it was there. Not in the barn, not outside. Somewhere ahead. Waiting. For both of them. And for the first time since the truck had pulled away that morning, Caleb didn't feel completely empty. He didn't feel better. But he felt something else. Something small. Something quiet. Something that hadn't been there before. Possibility. It didn't arrive loud. It didn't demand attention. It just sat there. Quiet and unfamiliar. Like a thought Caleb hadn't allowed himself to have in a long time. Morning came slowly over the barn, pale light slipping through the wooden slats in thin lines that stretched across the floor. The heater had clicked off sometime before dawn, leaving the air cold enough to sting the lungs. Caleb sat on the edge of the cot, boots already on, hands wrapped loosely around a dented metal mug of coffee. The steam curled upward, thin and fading fast. Across the room, Coda stood by the door again, not restless, not anxious, just watching. Caleb followed his gaze. Nothing there. Just the barn door, shut tight, frost clinging to the edges where the cold had settled overnight. "You hear something?" Caleb asked. Coda didn't move. That was answer enough. Caleb set the mug down and stood, his joints stiff from the cold. He crossed the room slowly, every step measured out of habit more than necessity. His hand reached for the latch. For a moment he hesitated. It didn't make sense, but the feeling from the night before, something shifting, something waiting, lingered in the back of his mind. Then he opened the door. Cold air pushed in immediately, sharper than before, carrying the scent of snow and pine. The sky had cleared overnight, pale blue stretching wide above the trees, and on the ground, just beyond the threshold, an envelope. Caleb stared at it. It hadn't been there the night before. He was sure of that. Coda stepped past him, nose lowering to the ground, sniffing once, then stopping. Not curious, focused. Caleb bent down and picked it up. Thick paper, cream-colored, the kind people used when they wanted something to feel official, important. His name was printed clearly across the front. Caleb Hayes. No smudges. No forwarding marks visible on the outside. Just his name. Clean. Certain. He turned it over. A return address stamped in dark ink, Collins and Barrett. Attorneys at Law Portland. Maine, Caleb frowned slightly. "How'd you find me?" he muttered. Coda's ears shifted. The dog's attention wasn't on the barn. It was on the envelope. Watching it. Caleb noticed. "You already don't like it," he said quietly. Coda didn't react, but he didn't look away either. Caleb stepped back inside, closing the door behind him. The barn felt smaller suddenly, the air tighter. He walked to the cot and sat down again, the envelope resting in his hands. For a long moment, He didn't open it. He had seen enough letters over the past few months. Notices, bills, rejections, words that closed doors one after another until there weren't any left to knock on. This one felt different. Not better. Just heavier. Coda moved closer, stopping just beside him. Close enough that their shoulders almost touched. Caleb exhaled slowly. "All right," he said. He slid a finger under the seal and opened it. The paper inside was folded neatly, formal, precise. He unfolded it and began to read. At first, the words didn't fully register. Legal language, structured sentences, names and references that didn't belong to his life. Then one line stopped him, identified as the sole remaining heir. Caleb blinked. Read it again. Slower this time. To the estate of Eleanor Whitaker. He leaned back slightly, eyes narrowing. Whitaker. The name stirred something faint, a memory that didn't quite form. His mother mentioning distant relatives once, years ago. People who lived somewhere along the coast. People they didn't talk about much. He kept reading. Property located in northern Maine. Unoccupied for over 2 decades. No liquid assets currently verified. Full rights subject to acceptance. Caleb lowered the paper slightly. The barn felt quiet again. Too quiet. Coda shifted beside him, nudging his arm once. Not impatient, just present. Caleb looked down at him. "You understand any of this?" he asked. Coda blinked once. That steady, unbothered look. Caleb almost smiled. Almost. He looked back at the letter. A house, an estate, left to him. No money, no guarantees, just land, buildings, something abandoned long enough to be forgotten or hidden. He read the last paragraph. "You are under no obligation to accept. Inspection can be arranged. Please contact our office." Caleb folded the letter slowly, carefully, like it might disappear if he moved too fast. "A house," he said under his breath. The word felt strange, foreign. He hadn't had one in, what, a day? 2? Long enough. Too long already. Coda leaned slightly into his side. Caleb rested his hand on the dog's neck again, fingers pressing lightly into the thick fur. "What do you think?" he asked. Coda didn't answer, but his posture changed, just slightly, more alert, like he had already decided something. Caleb noticed. Of course he did. "You want to go," he said quietly. Coda's ears lifted. That was enough. Caleb exhaled through his nose, a faint breath that carried more weight than sound. "It's probably nothing," he said. "Old place. Falling apart. More trouble than it's worth." Coda didn't move. Didn't look away. Caleb stared at the letter in his hands. Nothing had worked so far. Not the job applications, not the waiting, not the trying to fit into a life that didn't seem to have space for him anymore. This wasn't a solution. It wasn't a plan. It was just a direction, and right now, that was more than he had yesterday. He stood up. Decision made. "All right," he said. "We'll take a look." Coda stepped back slightly, giving him space, but his focus stayed sharp. Caleb folded the letter once more and slid it into his jacket pocket. Outside, the snow had begun to melt in thin patches where the sun reached through the trees. The road stretched out ahead, quiet and waiting, the same as before, but not quite the same, because now there was somewhere to go, and somewhere far beyond the trees and the frozen roads. Something was waiting, not for just anyone, for him, and for the dog who had already started listening to it. The truck pulled onto the narrow road just after sunrise, tires crunching over a thin layer of ice that hadn't melted yet. The sky stretched wide and pale above the tree line, the kind of cold blue that made everything feel farther away than it really was. Caleb didn't turn on the radio. He didn't need noise. The engine was enough. The road was enough. Beside him, Coda sat upright in the passenger seat, his posture steady, his gaze fixed ahead. The dog hadn't relaxed since Caleb folded the letter into his jacket. Not tense, not restless, just focused. Like he was tracking something Caleb couldn't see. They drove north. The town faded quickly behind them, replaced by long stretches of forest that swallowed the road in quiet layers of pine and bare branches. Snow lingered in shaded patches, untouched and smooth, while sunlight broke through in sharp angles where the trees thinned. Miles passed without interruption. No traffic, no houses, just road and trees, and the occasional sign half covered in frost. Caleb drove with both hands on the wheel, his shoulders set, his eyes scanning without thinking. Old habits didn't leave. They just changed shape. He checked the rearview mirror. Empty. Checked the road ahead. Clear. But something about the silence felt different now, not empty. Waiting. He shifted slightly in his seat. "You feel it too?" he asked. Coda didn't look at him. The dog's ears lifted just a fraction higher. That was answer enough. The road narrowed further as they climbed into higher ground. Snow thickened along the edges, packed down in places where wind had pushed it into uneven drifts. The trees grew closer together, their branches arching overhead like a tunnel of shadow and light. A faded sign appeared on the right side of the road. Morro Bay, 12 miles. The paint was chipped, the edges worn, like it had been standing there longer than anyone cared to remember. Caleb slowed slightly as they passed it. Morro Bay, he muttered. The name didn't mean anything to him, but it would. The road dipped after that, curving downward into a stretch of land where the forest opened just enough to reveal distant water. A narrow strip of gray-blue cutting through the trees, calm and cold beneath the morning light. Fog clung low along its surface, drifting slowly like breath. Coda shifted for the first time since they started driving. Not much, just enough to bring his nose closer to the cracked window. Air moved through the gap, carrying new scents. Salt, damp wood, something older. The dog inhaled slowly, then sat still again. Caleb noticed. Of course he did. "That it?" he asked quietly. Coda didn't respond, but his focus sharpened. The closer they got, the quieter the world seemed to become. Even the wind felt different here, less movement, more presence. The town itself appeared without warning, a handful of buildings clustered near the water. A small dock stretching out into the bay, a diner with fogged windows, a general store with a faded sign hanging slightly crooked above the door. It wasn't abandoned, but it wasn't alive either. People moved slowly, quietly, like they had learned not to expect much from the outside world. Caleb drove through without stopping. Eyes followed the truck, not openly, but enough. Outsiders didn't pass through here often, and when they did, people noticed. At the far end of town, the road split. One path led along the shoreline, the other turned inward, toward the trees again. Caleb slowed at the fork. He didn't need to check the map. Coda was already turning his head, looking down the second road, the darker one, narrower, less traveled. Caleb nodded once. "Figured," he said. He turned the wheel. The truck rolled onto the smaller road, gravel crunching beneath the tires as the forest closed in again. This stretch felt older, less maintained. Branches leaned closer to the path, and patches of snow remained untouched where sunlight couldn't reach. A mile in, the road grew rough. 2 miles, quieter. 3. Still. Then Caleb saw it. Not all at once, just pieces at first. Stone, dark against the snow. Then a wall, low, uneven, running parallel to the road before disappearing into the trees. He slowed. Coda sat straighter. The air changed again. He could feel it this time. Not just the dog. Something subtle. A pressure. Like stepping into a place where time had settled differently. Another turn. And then the estate revealed itself. It stood beyond a wide clearing, set back just far enough that it didn't feel like it belonged to the road at all. A large structure of dark stone and weathered wood, its windows tall and narrow, reflecting the pale sky like distant mirrors. The roof sloped steeply, covered in moss and patches of old slate. Ivy clung to the sides in dry, tangled strands, reaching upward as if it had forgotten when to stop growing. It wasn't broken. It wasn't ruined. It was still. Like it had been waiting. Caleb brought the truck to a stop near the edge of the clearing. The engine idled low. Neither of them moved. Coda was already watching the house. Not the front, not the main entrance. Something else. Caleb followed his gaze. The left side of the building, partially hidden by overgrown shrubs and shadow. That's where you want to go, Caleb said. Coda stood. Caleb turned off the engine. Silence settled instantly. Deeper than before. He opened the door and stepped out, boots sinking slightly into the snow-covered ground. The cold here felt sharper, cleaner, like it hadn't been touched by anything recent. Coda jumped down beside him, landing quietly. No hesitation, no uncertainty. The dog moved forward, not rushing, but with purpose. Past the main steps, past the wide front door that stood closed and untouched, straight toward the side of the house. Caleb watched him go for a second, then followed. Every step closer made something in his chest tighten. Not fear, not exactly. Awareness. The kind that came before something changed. The kind that told him this wasn't just a house. It was something else. And Coda already knew it. The dog stopped near a section of wall half covered in dead vines. There. A door. Narrow. Wooden. Almost invisible beneath the growth. Coda sat in front of it. Still, waiting. Caleb stepped closer, brushing aside the vines with one hand. The wood beneath was solid, cold, untouched. He placed his hand against it. The surface felt different, not abandoned, closed. He glanced down at Coda. "You sure about this?" he asked. Coda looked up at him, calm, certain. Caleb nodded once. All right. Because whatever had been waiting had just found them. Caleb kept his hand on the wood a moment longer than necessary. The door didn't feel like it belonged to neglect. There was no soft give, no splintering edge. It was firm, closed with purpose, not time. Coda remained seated at his side, steady as a post, his eyes fixed on the seam where the door met the frame. "All right," Caleb murmured. He tested the handle. It didn't turn. Locked. Of course. Caleb stepped back slightly, scanning the frame out of instinct. Hinges. Latch. No modern lock. No keypad. Nothing recent. Just an old iron mechanism set deep into the wood. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the folded letter again. The law firm had mentioned access. Keys. He hadn't expected to need them this soon. Moving back toward the truck, Caleb opened the glove compartment and retrieved a small envelope tucked beside the registration papers. He hadn't paid much attention to it earlier, just assumed it was part of the legal paperwork. Inside, a single key rested against the paper. Heavy. Old. The kind that belonged to something built to last. Caleb turned it once in his fingers, then walked back toward the door. Coda hadn't moved. "Guess we're doing this," Caleb said. He slid the key into the lock. For a second, nothing happened. Then, a dull click. The sound echoed deeper than it should have, traveling somewhere beyond the door itself. like it had passed through more than just a lock. Caleb paused. Coda's ears lifted. Then Caleb turned the handle. The door opened slowly, not with the sharp creak of something broken, but with a low, reluctant sound, like it hadn't been used in a long time, and didn't intend to be. Cold air slipped out from the darkness beyond, brushing against Caleb's face. It carried a scent he couldn't place at first. Not rot. Not decay. Something older. Paper. Wood. Dust. And something beneath it. Stillness. Caleb stepped inside. The light shifted immediately. Outside, the snow had reflected brightness into the clearing. Inside, the space swallowed it, turning everything softer, dimmer. A narrow corridor stretched ahead. Stone walls, wooden floorboards, a row of iron hooks mounted along one side, empty now but worn smooth where something had hung for years. A bench sat beneath them. Simple, solid, used. Coda moved past him without hesitation. No hesitation at all. That was what Caleb noticed most. The dog didn't pause at the threshold, didn't test the ground, didn't scan for threat the way he normally would in unfamiliar spaces. He just moved, like he recognized something. Caleb followed. Each step echoed slightly beneath his boots, the sound absorbed quickly by the walls. The air remained cold, but not damp, dry, preserved. The corridor opened into a larger room, a kitchen, or what had once been one. Everything was still there. Copper pans hung above a long wooden table. A stove stood against the far wall, enamel chipped but intact. Shelves lined with jars, empty now, but arranged carefully by size. Nothing disturbed, no signs of intrusion, no signs of abandonment either. It looked like someone had stepped out and never come back. Caleb moved slowly through the space, eyes scanning every detail. No dust piles in corners, no scattered debris, just a thin, even layer of time settling over everything. "That's not normal," he said under his breath. Coda stood near the far doorway, head slightly lowered, nose working quietly, tracking, but not like before. This wasn't a fresh scent. It was older, fainter, and still present. Caleb stepped into the main hall. The space opened wide in front of him, the ceiling rising high above. A staircase curved upward along one wall, its railing smooth and dark. Tall windows lined the opposite side, light filtering through layers of grime that softened the outside world into muted shapes. Portraits hung along the walls, faces blurred by dust, their expressions unreadable. Watching. The silence here was heavier, not empty, occupied. Caleb stopped near the center of the room. His body had shifted without him noticing, shoulders tighter, breathing controlled, eyes moving from point to point, mapping the space. Old habits. But something else was there too. A feeling. Like stepping into a place that remembered things. Coda crossed the floor slowly, then stopped. Near the base of the staircase, he turned his head once toward Caleb, then back to the wall. A small door sat beneath the stairs, low, unmarked, closed. Caleb walked over. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered. He tested the handle. Locked. Again, he glanced at the key in his hand. Still there. Still heavy. He tried it. It didn't fit. "Different one," he said. Coda didn't move, but he didn't leave either. Caleb exhaled slowly and stepped back. "All right. One thing at a time." He turned away from the door, scanning the rest of the hall. There were other rooms, other doors, each one holding its own silence, each one waiting. He moved through them carefully. A sitting room with covered furniture. A study lined with books, their spines faded but intact. A dining room where chairs sat pushed in neatly around a long table, as if expecting guests that never arrived. Nothing broken. Nothing stolen. Nothing disturbed. It didn't make sense. Places like this didn't stay untouched. Not for years. Not without reason. Caleb returned to the main hall. Coda was still there. Waiting. Not for him. For something else. Caleb followed the dog's gaze again. The small door beneath the stairs. Locked. Unopened. Unanswered. He stepped closer. Something about it felt different from the rest of the house. Not hidden. Not exactly. More like unfinished. Caleb crouched slightly, studying the edges of the frame. No dust built up along the seam. No warping in the wood. This door had been used, more recently than anything else here. He straightened slowly. Behind him, the house remained still. Ahead of him, the unknown. And beside him, Coda shifted closer. Not anxious. Not afraid. Ready. Caleb rested a hand briefly on the dog's back. Yeah, he said quietly. I see it too. The house wasn't abandoned. It was waiting. And whatever it was holding wasn't meant for just anyone. But for the first time since stepping inside, Caleb understood something clearly. This wasn't about finding a place to stay. This wasn't about inheritance. This was something else. Something deeper. And whatever it was, Coda had already found the trail. Caleb stood in the center of the main hall, his eyes drifting once more toward the small locked door beneath the staircase. It pulled at his attention like something unfinished, something waiting to be understood. But instinct told him not to rush it. Not yet. Easy, he muttered. Coda shifted slightly beside him, but didn't move away from the door. His focus lingered there, steady and unbroken, like a thread stretched tight between the present and something buried deeper. Caleb turned away. There were other answers in the house, other pieces that might explain what this place really was. He moved back through the kitchen, then into a narrower hallway he hadn't fully explored. The air here felt the same, dry, preserved, but quieter somehow, less open, more contained. A door stood halfway down the corridor. Unlike the others, it was slightly ajar. Caleb paused. Coda came up beside him again, silent as always. You didn't pick this one, Caleb said under his breath. Still, he reached out and pushed the door open. Inside, a study. Smaller than the one he had seen before, less formal, more personal. A desk stood near the far wall, its surface covered in papers that hadn't been touched in years. A single lamp rested at the corner, its shade tilted slightly. Shelves lined the walls, filled with ledgers, folders, and tightly packed boxes. Caleb stepped inside slowly. This room felt different, not grand, not staged. Used. He approached the desk first. The papers were stacked neatly, each one labeled in careful handwriting. Dates, names, locations. He picked one up, a list, simple at first glance, just names and numbers, but something about it felt deliberate, structured. He scanned the top line. Samuel Price, groundskeeper, 1947 to 1962. Below it, Martha Keene, house staff, 1951 to 1978. Thomas Reed, shipyard labor, 1939 to 1955. Lib's brow tightened. These aren't expenses, he murmured. Coda remained near the doorway, watching him. Caleb set the paper down and opened one of the boxes on the shelf. Inside were folders, each one labeled, each one carrying a name. He pulled one at random, opened it. Letters. Old. Yellowed with age, but preserved carefully. The handwriting varied, some clean, some rushed, some uneven like they had been written under pressure. He read a few lines. A man writing about lost work during a harsh winter. A woman describing selling family belongings to get through the year. A note from someone thanking the estate for taking what we could not keep. Caleb closed the folder slowly. His chest felt tighter again, but not from the same place as before. This wasn't memory. This was something else. He opened another. Photographs this time. Black and white. People standing in front of buildings, fields, docks, faces lined with effort, with years, not posed for display, captured in passing, real. These are records, Caleb said quietly, not to Coda, to himself, not wealth, not assets, people, lives, stories. Coda stepped further into the room, not toward the desk, toward another shelf. He stopped there, lowered his head slightly. Caleb followed. Another set of boxes. These ones older. The labels were different, faded, handwritten in ink that had begun to blur at the edges. Caleb picked one up. The lid came off easily. Inside, more folders. But these felt heavier somehow, more deliberate. He opened one. The name at the top, Daniel Hayes. Caleb froze. For a second, the room seemed to tilt. He read it again. Daniel Hayes. The date beside it. His hand tightened slightly around the folder. That's... he started, then stopped. His grandfather's name. A man he had only heard about in passing. A photograph once, maybe. A story told half-finished and never returned to. He flipped through the pages. A record of employment, short-term, labor work tied to the estate. A note at the bottom. Compensation accepted in exchange for personal items. Caleb's jaw set. What personal items? He muttered. There was no answer in the file. Just a list. And a signature. He closed the folder carefully, set it back, then looked around the room again. It wasn't just a study. It was an archive, but not one meant for display. One meant to hold things, to keep them. Away. A sound behind him broke the silence. Footsteps. Outside. Caleb turned instantly, his body reacting before his mind caught up. His hand moved instinctively toward his side, where a weapon used to be. Empty. Coda was already at the doorway, alert. Still. Caleb stepped out into the hallway. The sound came again, from the front of the house, boots on wood. Not many, just one set, measured, unhurried. Caleb moved toward the main hall, every step quiet, controlled. Coda stayed close. When they reached the opening, a woman stood near the front entrance, late 50s, early 60s, gray hair pulled back neatly, a long coat dusted lightly with snow. She turned when she heard him, no surprise in her expression, just recognition. Mr. Hayes, she said calmly. Caleb didn't relax. Who are you? Margaret Collins, she replied, stepping forward slightly. Attorney for the Whitaker estate. Caleb studied her. You didn't mention stopping by. You didn't mention arriving early, she said evenly. That earned a faint, almost invisible shift in his posture. Fair enough. Coda remained between them. Margaret glanced down at the dog briefly, then back to Caleb. He's been finding things, hasn't he? She said. Caleb didn't answer right away. What kind of things? He asked instead. Margaret's gaze moved past him, toward the hallway. Things this house was built to keep. Caleb's eyes narrowed slightly. Records, he said. Margaret nodded once. Yes. A pause settled between them. Not uncomfortable. Measured. Then another sound, this time outside. An engine. Low, smooth, expensive. Both Caleb and Margaret turned toward the front door. Through the tall windows, a dark vehicle rolled slowly into view, tires pressing clean lines into the snow. It stopped near the clearing. The engine cut. Silence returned. But not the same silence. This one carried weight, expectation. Margaret's expression shifted slightly. Not fear. Recognition. They didn't waste time, she said quietly. Caleb looked at her. Who? The car door opened. A man stepped out. Tall, well-dressed, controlled. He took in the house slowly, like he had already decided something about it long before arriving. Coda's posture changed instantly. Not aggressive, but firm, protective. Caleb felt it, without needing to look. What does he want? Caleb asked. Margaret didn't take her eyes off the man outside. The same thing everyone eventually does, she said. Caleb's jaw tightened. And that is? Margaret exhaled softly. This house. The man began walking toward the front steps, slow, confident, certain. Caleb stood his ground, Coda at his side, the house behind them. And for the first time since arriving, Caleb understood. This wasn't just something waiting to be found. It was something others had already been looking for. The man stepped onto the front porch without hesitation. His shoes made no sound on the old wood, but his presence carried weight all the same. He adjusted his coat once, briefly, then knocked, firm, controlled, unnecessary. He already knew someone was inside. Caleb didn't move right away. Coda stood beside him, body aligned with Caleb's leg, eyes fixed on the door. Not aggressive, not barking, just ready. Margaret stepped forward first. I'll handle this, she said quietly. Caleb didn't argue, but he didn't step back either. Margaret opened the door. Cold air slipped inside again, along with the man. Mr. Hayes, he said, his voice smooth, measured. I was hoping we'd meet. Caleb studied him. Late 40s, maybe early 50s. Clean cut, composed. The kind of man who didn't rush because he never had to. And you are? Caleb asked. Trent Dalton, he replied. Dalton Development. Coda shifted slightly. Just enough. Dalton's eyes flicked downward for a second, then back up. Impressive dog, he said. He's not here to impress you, Caleb replied. Dalton smiled faintly. I wouldn't expect him to be. The room settled into a quiet tension. Dalton stepped further inside, taking in the space with a slow, deliberate glance. Not curious, evaluating. You've found more than most people do on their first visit, he said. Caleb's eyes narrowed slightly. Been here before? He asked. Dalton's smile didn't change. Not inside, he said, but I've had an interest in this property for some time. Margaret crossed her arms lightly. Your interest has been noted, she said, and declined. Dalton glanced at her. By the previous owner, he corrected. Circumstances have changed. Caleb stepped forward a fraction. What do you want? He asked. Dalton met his gaze directly now. The same thing you're trying to understand, he said. What this place is worth. Caleb didn't answer, because he already knew. This wasn't about land. Dalton reached into his coat and pulled out a folder. I'm prepared to make an offer, he said calmly. One that would remove any burden associated with ownership. He held the folder out. Caleb didn't take it. Coda stepped forward instead. Not aggressive, just enough to block the space between them. Dalton paused, then lowered his hand slowly. Understood, he said. He placed the folder on a nearby table instead. You don't need to decide today, he added, but I would advise you not to wait too long. Properties like this. He glanced around once more, tend to carry complications. Caleb's voice stayed even. Meaning? Dalton's expression shifted slightly. Meaning, he said, there are things here that don't always stay hidden. A quiet settled over the room. Not comfortable, not neutral, heavy. Dalton straightened his coat again. I'll give you time, he said, but not too much. Then he turned and walked back toward the door. Margaret watched him go. Caleb didn't. He was already looking at Coda. The dog hadn't moved from his position, still facing the table, still focused. Not on Dalton. On something else. Caleb followed his gaze. The hallway, the one leading back toward the study, toward the shelves, toward the door beneath the stairs. Yeah, Caleb said quietly. I see it. Dalton left without another word. The sound of his car starting carried faintly through the walls, then faded into the distance. Silence returned, but not the same silence as before. This one felt closer. Margaret exhaled slowly. He's not going to stop, she said. Caleb nodded. I figured. She turned to him. You need to understand something, she continued. This estate, what it holds, it's not just valuable, it's complicated. Legally, historically, and for some people, personally. Caleb looked back toward the hallway. I'm starting to see that. Margaret hesitated, then said, there are areas of this house that were never fully documented. Caleb glanced at her. Like what? She held his gaze for a moment, then nodded slightly. You already found one, didn't you? Caleb didn't answer. He didn't need to. Coda had already started moving. Back toward the main hall. Back toward the staircase. Caleb followed. Margaret came behind them. The house felt different now. Not just quiet. Aware. They reached the base of the stairs. The small door waited there, unchanged, unopened, but no longer unnoticed. Coda stopped in front of it again, sat, looked up at Caleb, same as before. But this time, there was no hesitation. Caleb stepped forward. The first key hadn't worked, but the envelope in his pocket, there had been more. He reached inside, pulled out the small ring he hadn't noticed before. 3 keys, different sizes, different shapes. He held them up. Let's try this again, he said. The first key didn't fit. The second turned halfway, stopped. Caleb adjusted his grip, applied a little more pressure. The mechanism resisted, then gave. A deeper click echoed behind the door. Coda's ears lifted. Caleb turned the handle. The door opened. This time, the air cuisson that came out was colder, sharper, different. A narrow set of stone steps led downward into darkness. Margaret drew in a quiet breath. That's not on any plan I've seen, she said. Caleb didn't respond. He was already focused. The old instincts had returned fully now. Clear, precise. Stay behind me, he said. Not as a command. As habit. He stepped onto the first stair. Coda moved ahead of him immediately. Slow, careful, certain. Each step echoed faintly as they descended. The light from above faded quickly. The darkness below didn't feel empty. It felt contained. Waiting. At the bottom, the space opened. A corridor, brick walls, concrete floor, and along both sides, shelves, boxes, cabinets, all organized, all labeled, perfectly. Caleb stepped forward slowly. Margaret followed, her breath quieter now. Coda moved ahead, scanning the space with steady focus. Caleb reached the first shelf, ran his hand along the edge of a wooden crate. Dust-free. Maintained. He looked at the label. Handwritten. Clear. Harbor workers, 1931. Next one. Family records, 1948. Another, veterans. Personal effects. Caleb's chest tightened. This isn't storage, he said quietly. Margaret nodded. No, she replied. It's something else. At the center of the room, a table. On it, a single book. Bound in dark leather. Untouched. Caleb stepped closer. Opened it. The first page held a single line. Written carefully. Deliberately. Some things are not owned. They are only kept until the right hands arrive. Caleb read it once. Then again. Coda came to stand beside him. Still. Steady. Caleb closed the book slowly. Looked around the room again. At the names. The records. The lives stored in silence. Then back at the staircase behind them. At the world above. And for the first time, he understood what Dalton had meant. This place didn't just hold value. It held truth. And whatever that truth was, it wasn't meant to stay buried. The air in the underground room felt steady, almost protected, as if time itself had been asked to slow down and wait. Caleb stood at the center table, the leather-bound book still beneath his hand, while the shelves around him held rows of carefully labeled boxes. Coda didn't wander. He stayed close. Not because he was unsure, because something here mattered. Caleb moved to the nearest shelf and pulled down a wooden crate. It wasn't heavy, but it carried a weight that had nothing to do with size. He set it on the table and lifted the lid. Inside, cloth-wrapped bundles. He unwrapped the first one. A photograph. Black and white. A group of men standing outside what looked like a shipyard, their faces worn but steady, their hands thick with labor. One of them stood slightly forward, not by design, but by presence. Caleb studied the image. No names written on the front. He flipped it over. There, in careful handwriting, dock crew, winter season, 1931. He set it down gently, opened another bundle. Letters, folded, preserved, tied with thin twine that had yellowed with time. He untied one and unfolded it carefully. The paper crackled slightly. The writing was uneven, not uneducated, just hurried. I'm sending what we can. The rest had to go. They said the house would keep it safe. Caleb stopped reading. His jaw tightened. He looked at Margaret. She had moved closer, her expression quieter now, more careful. This is personal, she said softly. Caleb nodded. Yeah, he replied. He opened another letter. Different handwriting. Stronger. They told us it would be temporary, just until things got better. Another. We had no choice. He set them down one by one. Each piece told the same kind of story. Different names. Same outcome. Loss. Coda shifted slightly beside him, his body pressing just enough to remind Caleb where he was. Not then, now. Caleb exhaled slowly. They gave things up, he said. Margaret didn't interrupt. He continued. Not because they wanted to, because they had to. He looked around the room again, at the shelves, the boxes, the names, and this place kept it. Margaret nodded once. That seems to be the case. Caleb picked up another file, opened it. Inside, a list. Detailed. Items. Dates. Names. He scanned the page, then stopped. A word stood out. Veteran. He turned the page. More entries. More names. Men who had served. Men who had come back. Men who had lost something along the way. Caleb's grip tightened. This wasn't random, he said. No, Margaret replied quietly. It wasn't. He closed the file slowly. His chest felt heavier now. Not from fear. From understanding. Coda moved forward then. Not toward the shelves. Toward the far end of the room. There. Another table. Smaller. Less organized. Caleb followed. On the table sat a series of objects laid out carefully. A watch. Scratched, but intact. A set of dog tags. A folded flag, smaller than standard, worn at the edges. Caleb stopped. His breath slowed. He reached out, picked up the dog tags, turned them over. The metal was cold. The name engraved across the surface, not his, but familiar in a way he couldn't explain. Another veteran, another story. Left here. He set them back down gently. Coda stood beside him, head slightly lowered, respectful. Caleb noticed. You feel it too, he said quietly. Coda didn't move. Didn't need to. Caleb stepped back from the table. The room no longer felt like a discovery. It felt like a responsibility. Margaret spoke again, her voice steady. Mr. Hayes. Caleb. This changes things. He looked at her. How? She hesitated, then said, If what's here is verified, and it will be, it's not just historically significant, it's valuable. Caleb didn't react. She continued, Extremely valuable. He glanced back at the shelves, at the objects. At what cost? He asked. Margaret didn't answer right away, because there wasn't a simple one. The silence stretched. Then, a faint sound above. Distant. Movement. Both of them turned slightly. Coda's ears lifted. Caleb's focus sharpened instantly. Someone else here? He asked. Margaret shook her head. No one was supposed to. The sound came again. Wood shifting. Not loud, but enough. Caleb moved toward the stairs. Coda was already ahead of him. They climbed quickly. Back into the main hall. Light filtered down from the windows, unchanged. But the feeling, different. Caleb scanned the room. Nothing out of place, no one visible. Still, something had shifted. Coda stood near the entrance, listening, watching. Caleb stepped forward slowly. The front door remained closed. But outside, the snow had changed. Fresh tracks, not from before. New. He opened the door. Cold air rushed in. He stepped out. The clearing stretched ahead. Quiet. Empty. But the tracks clear. A second vehicle had been here. Recently. Close enough to watch. Then gone. Caleb's jaw tightened. He looked back toward the house, toward the door beneath the stairs, toward the room below. They know, he said. Margaret stepped up beside him. Yes, she replied quietly. Caleb looked out at the tree line. The silence beyond it no longer felt empty. It felt watched. And for the first time since stepping into the estate, the weight of what he had found settled fully. Not just value, not just history. Something else. Something that would not stay hidden. Coda stepped beside him again. Solid. Steady. Ready. Caleb rested a hand briefly on his back, then looked forward. They're not the only ones looking anymore, he said. And this time, he wasn't just talking about the house. Caleb stood at the edge of the clearing, eyes fixed on the fresh tire tracks cutting through the snow. They were clean, deliberate. Whoever had come here hadn't been lost. They had known exactly where to go, and exactly when to leave. Coda stood beside him, body angled slightly forward, gaze locked on the tree line. Not chasing, not reacting, assessing. The wind moved lightly through the branches, carrying no sound of retreat, no engine, no voices, just silence settling back into place like it had never been disturbed. They were watching, Caleb said. Margaret didn't deny it. Yes, she replied quietly. And now they know you've been inside. Caleb exhaled slowly. He turned back toward the house. The estate no longer felt like a forgotten place. It felt exposed, vulnerable, alive in a way that drew attention instead of hiding from it. Let's go inside, Margaret said. We shouldn't stay out here. Caleb nodded once. They stepped back through the front door, closing it firmly behind them. The quiet returned immediately, but it wasn't the same quiet as before. Now it held tension. Coda didn't relax. He moved through the main hall slowly, checking corners, scanning spaces, his instincts fully engaged, not because something was wrong, but because something could be. Caleb walked back toward the central room, his mind already working through what came next. What happens now? He asked. Margaret followed, her expression thoughtful. Now, she said, this becomes complicated. Caleb gave a faint, humorless breath. Feels like we passed complicated a while ago. Margaret didn't argue. Instead, she moved to the table where Dalton had left the folder. She picked it up, held it for a moment, then offered it to Caleb. This is part of it, she said. Caleb looked at the folder. Didn't take it right away. Coda stepped closer. Not blocking this time. Just present. Caleb reached out and took it. Opened it. Inside. Documents. Clean. Professional. Precise for Soho. Numbers stood out first. Large ones. He read through quickly. Land valuation, structural estimates, projected redevelopment costs, and then the offer, a number that didn't feel real. He read it again, slower this time, then looked up. That's serious money, he said. Margaret nodded. Yes. Caleb closed the folder halfway. Enough to walk away, he added. More than enough, Margaret replied. The room fell quiet again. Coda shifted slightly, pressing against Caleb's leg, grounding him. Caleb stared at the papers. His mind moved faster now, not with panic, with memory. Cold nights, empty bank accounts, the sound of rejection delivered politely over the phone. The weight of not knowing what came next. All of it could end. Right here, with a signature. He could take the money, fix everything, start over. No more Barnes, no more waiting, no more wondering if the next day would be worse than the last. Just relief. He closed his eyes briefly. The thought sat there. Tempting, clear, simple. When he opened them again, Coda was watching him. Not the folder, not the room, him. Caleb let out a slow breath. You don't like it, he said quietly. Coda didn't move, but his posture tightened just slightly. Enough. Caleb looked back at the folder, at the number, then past it, to the hallway, to the door beneath the stairs, to the room below. The names, the records, the lives that had been stored and forgotten. This wasn't just property. It wasn't just land. It was something else. And selling it wouldn't just be a transaction. It would be an ending. Margaret spoke again, her voice calm. You don't have to decide today. Caleb nodded. I know. She studied him for a moment. Most people would take it, she added. Caleb gave a faint, tired smile. Most people aren't standing where I am. That was the truth, because this wasn't just about money. It was about what he had found, and what it meant. A sound outside broke the moment. An engine. Again. Caleb turned immediately. Coda was already moving. They stepped toward the front of the house just as the vehicle came into view through the windows. Same car. Same man. Dalton stepped out once more. No rush. No hesitation. Like he had expected this. Caleb opened the door before he reached it. Cold air rushed in. Dalton stopped a few feet from the steps, looked at him. Calm, confident. "I assume you've had time to review the offer," he said. Caleb held the folder loosely at his side. "Fast turnaround," he replied. Dalton gave a small nod. "Opportunities don't stay open forever." Coda stood at Caleb's side. Still. Watching. Dalton's eyes flicked down again, then back up. "You've found something," he said. "Not a question, a statement." Caleb didn't confirm it, didn't deny it. Dalton continued. "I'll be direct," he said. "What's in that house? It's more than you think, more than you're prepared to handle." Caleb's voice stayed even. "Try me." Dalton smiled slightly. "History has value," he said, "but only if it's managed properly, preserved, protected. Otherwise, it becomes a burden." He stepped closer. Not threatening, but intentional. "I can take that burden off your hands," he added. Caleb looked at him for a long moment, then said, "Or bury it." Dalton's expression didn't change. "Some things are better left where they are," he said. That landed, not loudly, but clearly. Caleb felt it. Coda shifted again. Closer, between them. Dalton stopped there. Didn't push further. Smart. Caleb spoke again. "I'll think about it," he said. Dalton nodded. "I expected you would." He turned slightly, then paused. "One more thing," he added. Caleb didn't respond. Dalton looked back at the house. "Be careful what you uncover," he said. "Not everything in the past wants to be brought forward." Then he left. Again. The car disappeared into the trees. Silence followed. Caleb stood there a moment longer, the cold air settling around him. Then he looked down at Coda. The dog met his gaze. Steady. Certain. Caleb exhaled slowly. "Yeah," he said. "I know." He turned back toward the house, toward the door, toward everything waiting inside. The offer sat in his hand. Heavy, real. But for the first time, it didn't feel like a solution. It felt like a test. Caleb stood in the doorway a moment longer after Dalton's car disappeared into the trees. The engine noise faded quickly, swallowed by distance and forest, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than before. He closed the door slowly. The latch clicked into place with a final sound that echoed faintly through the hall. Coda didn't move far. He stayed close. Closer than usual. Caleb noticed. "Yeah," he said quietly. "We're not alone in this anymore." He turned and walked back toward the center of the house, the folder still in his hand. He didn't open it again. Didn't need to. The number inside it had already settled into his mind. It would have solved everything. That was the problem. Margaret stood near the table, watching him carefully. "You're thinking about it," she said. Caleb didn't deny it. "I'd be stupid not to," he replied. She nodded. "Of course." He set the folder down, not thrown, not dismissed, just placed, like something he wasn't ready to carry. Then he looked back toward the hallway, toward the door beneath the stairs, toward the room below. "That place down there," he began, then paused. Margaret waited. "It's not just storage," he said. "No," she replied. "It isn't. Caleb exhaled slowly. I need to understand it. Margaret hesitated, then nodded. Then we start properly, she said. How? We document everything, carefully, legally. If what's there is what I think it is, you're going to need more than just instincts. Caleb gave a faint, tired look. Instincts got me this far. And they'll keep you alive, Margaret said. But they won't protect you from what this becomes. That landed. Caleb nodded once. All right, he said. They moved back toward the staircase. Coda went ahead, no hesitation, down the steps again. The air below felt colder now, sharper, like the space itself had shifted since they first entered. Caleb noticed immediately. You feel that? He asked quietly. Margaret did. Yes, she said. They stepped into the corridor again. Everything looked the same. Nothing disturbed. Nothing out of place. But something felt different. Coda moved quickly this time. Not scanning. Tracking. He passed the shelves they had already seen, ignored the main table, headed straight toward the far end of the room. Where are you going? Caleb asked. Coda didn't stop. He reached the last row of cabinets, then stopped. His body lowered slightly. Focused. Caleb followed. The cabinet looked like the others. Metal, labeled, locked. But the label was different, faded more than the rest, harder to read. Caleb brushed it lightly with his hand. The dust shifted. The words beneath. Private records. He frowned. That wasn't near the front, he said. Margaret stepped closer. No, she agreed. It wouldn't be. Caleb reached for the handle. Locked. Of course. He looked at the keys again. One left. He tried it. The lock resisted, then turned. A quiet click. Coda's ears lifted. Caleb opened the cabinet slowly. Inside, files. Fewer than the others, but thicker, more detailed. He pulled one out, set it on the nearby table, opened it. The first page, a name. Eleanor Whitaker. Caleb's eyes narrowed slightly. The owner, he said. Margaret nodded. Yes. He turned the page. Notes. Detailed. Precise. Not just records of items, but explanations, transactions, agreements, and something else. Context. Caleb read carefully, each line building something he hadn't expected. Eleanor Whitaker hadn't just collected items, she had acquired them, from people in need, during difficult times, workers, families, veterans, people who had no choice but to let things go. And she had taken them, not unfairly, not illegally, but not cleanly either. The next page confirmed it. Items accepted in exchange for immediate relief. Caleb's jaw tightened. That's not preservation, he said quietly. Margaret didn't interrupt. He continued reading. More names, more agreements, more stories. Then, at a section marked separately, retention policy. Caleb frowned. What's that? Margaret leaned closer. Keep reading. He did. The words were clear, direct. These items are to remain secured until such time as they may be returned, properly acknowledged, or entrusted to one capable of understanding their weight. Caleb stopped. Looked up. What does that mean? He asked. Margaret met his gaze. It means, she said slowly. She knew what she was doing wasn't simple. Caleb looked back down at the page. She kept everything, he said. Yes. And waited. Margaret nodded. For someone. The room fell quiet again. Coda stepped closer to the table. rested his head lightly against Caleb's arm, grounding him. Caleb exhaled slowly. "She didn't hide this," he said. "No," Margaret replied. "She protected it. That was different. Not better, but different." Caleb closed the file carefully, set it back in the cabinet, then looked around the room again. At the shelves, at the names, at the weight of everything stored here. "This isn't a fortune," he said. Margaret didn't answer, because she knew he wasn't finished. "It's a ledger," he continued, "of people who had to give things up." Coda stayed close, still, steady. Caleb nodded slightly. "And now it's mine." The words didn't feel right. Not fully. But they were true. A sudden sound cut through the room, sharp, above them, wood cracking. Caleb reacted instantly. "Coda, back," he said. The dog moved without hesitation. They stepped toward the stairs just as another sound followed, louder. A section of ceiling above the corridor shifted. Dust fell. Small debris scattered. Margaret stepped back quickly. "Careful!" she called. Caleb moved forward. Too close. A beam above them gave way slightly. Not collapsing, but enough. A piece of wood dropped sharply from above. Coda lunged. Fast. Faster than thought. He hit Caleb at the shoulder, hard, knocking him back just as the wood struck the ground where he had been standing. The impact echoed through the room. Silence followed. Heavy. Still. Caleb pushed himself up quickly. "Coda!" The dog stood a few feet away, but something was off. His stance, uneven. Caleb moved to him immediately. "Coda." "Hey." The dog didn't whine, didn't bark, but one of his front legs, he wasn't putting full weight on it. Caleb's chest tightened. "Stay still," he said quietly. He crouched down, checking carefully. No visible break, but the impact had hit him. Hard enough. Margaret stepped closer. "Is he—" "He'll be all right," Caleb said. But his voice carried something else. Concern. Real. Coda leaned into him slightly. Still steady. Still present. Caleb rested a hand on his neck. "Good call," he murmured. The dog didn't respond. Didn't need to. Caleb looked back at the fallen beam, then at the ceiling, then at the cabinet. The room had shifted again. Not just emotionally, physically. "You see that?" he said quietly. Margaret nodded. "Yes." Caleb stood slowly, helping Coda adjust beside him. "We're not just uncovering something," he said. Margaret watched him carefully. "No," she replied. "We're triggering it." Caleb looked around one last time, then toward the stairs, toward the house above, toward everything waiting beyond. The offer, the past, the truth, and now the cost. He rested his hand on Coda again. Firm. Steady. "I'm not walking away," he said quietly. Not to Margaret. Not to the house, to himself. And this time, there was no hesitation left. Morning broke over Morro Bay with a thin band of sunlight cutting across the water, turning the fog into pale gold. The estate stood quiet behind Caleb, its tall windows catching the light, like something waking up after a long sleep. Coda lay beside the front steps, his injured leg stretched slightly forward. He didn't complain, didn't shift more than necessary, but Caleb could see the difference. The dog still watched everything, still guarded, but now there was weight behind it. Caleb knelt beside him, running a careful hand along his shoulder. "You saved me," he said quietly. Coda's ears flicked once. That was enough. Caleb stood and looked back at the house. Everything had changed overnight, not just because of what they found, because of what it meant. Margaret stepped out onto the porch behind him, holding a folder and a phone. "I made some calls," she said. Caleb nodded. "I figured you would." She walked down the steps and stood beside him. "There's no quiet way to handle this anymore," she continued. "What's in that house? It's going to come out. The only question is how." Caleb looked toward the road. "They're already circling," he said. "Yes," Margaret replied, "and they won't stop." Caleb crossed his arms slightly, thinking. Then he said, "Good." Margaret turned to him. "That's not the reaction most people would have." Caleb gave a faint breath that might have been a laugh once. "I'm not most people." He looked back at the house. "I've spent too long reacting," he added. "Waiting. Taking whatever came next." He shook his head slightly. "Not this time." Coda pushed himself up slowly. Careful. Steady. He stepped closer to Caleb, leaning lightly against his leg. Still ready. Even now. Caleb rested his hand on the dog's back. "Neither of us is done," he said. Margaret watched them both, then nodded once. "Then we do it properly," she said. Caleb looked at her. "How?" She held up the folder. "We bring it into the open," she said. "Legally, publicly, before someone else decides what it's worth." Caleb understood immediately. "Town hall," he said. Margaret nodded. "Yes." By midday, the small municipal building at the center of Morro Bay was filled. Word had spread fast. It always did in places like this. People gathered in quiet clusters, locals, business owners, older residents who remembered names that hadn't been spoken in years, and a few who didn't belong. Watching. Waiting. Caleb stood near the front of the room, hands at his sides, posture steady. He wore the same jacket, the same boots. Nothing about him looked different. But everything was. Coda lay beside him, not as close as before, but close enough. Margaret stood to his right, papers organized, expression calm. The room settled slowly. Conversations faded. Eyes turned forward. Caleb stepped up. He didn't use a microphone. Didn't need to. His voice carried enough. "I wasn't planning on being here," he began, simple, direct. No performance. "I came to look at a house." A few quiet murmurs. He let them settle. "What I found wasn't just a house," he continued. He paused, looked around the room, at the faces, at the curiosity, at the expectation. "It was a record," he said, "of people." Silence followed. Deeper now. Margaret stepped forward slightly, opening one of the folders, displaying copies of the documents. Caleb continued. Names, families, workers, veterans. He glanced down briefly at Coda, then back up. People who had to give things up to survive. A shift moved through the room. Not loud, but real. Some faces changed. Recognition. Memory. Caleb let it sit, then said, "And everything they lost ended up in that house." A man near the back spoke quietly. "My grandfather worked near there," he said. Caleb nodded. "Then his name might be in those records." More murmurs. Margaret stepped in. "We're in the process of verifying everything," she said. "But the volume and condition of the material suggest significant historical and personal value." Caleb picked up from there. "I was offered money for it," he said. That caught attention. Of course it did. "Enough to walk away," he added. Eyes shifted, some surprised, some understanding, some already guessing the rest. Caleb didn't rush, didn't dramatize, he just said it. "I'm not taking it." The room went still, completely. Even the small sounds, Chairs, breathing, movement seemed to pause. Near the back, a figure shifted. Trent Dalton, standing, watching. Caleb met his gaze briefly, then looked back at the room. "This isn't mine to sell," he said. "Not like that." Dalton stepped forward slightly. "That's a generous interpretation," he said calmly, "but not a practical one." Caleb didn't turn toward him. He stayed focused on the room. "Maybe," he said, "but I didn't come back from everything I've seen just to do what's easy." That landed. Different this time. Stronger. He continued. "I'm going to restore the estate," he said. A ripple of reaction moved through the room. Not loud, but present. "And everything in it," he added, "will be documented. Returned where it can be. Preserved where it needs to be." Margaret stepped forward again. "We will establish a legal trust to manage the process," she said. "Full transparency, historical review, community involvement." Caleb nodded. "This isn't about money," he said. "It's about names." That word stayed. People felt it. Because everyone had one. Dalton spoke again. "You're underestimating the cost," he said. Caleb finally turned toward him. "No," he replied. "I'm choosing it." The room held that moment. Then, a voice from the side, an older woman. "My father worked the docks," she said. "If his name's in there, I'd like to see it." Another voice. "I can help with repairs," a man added. More followed. Not loud, not overwhelming, but enough. Enough to shift something. Dalton watched it happen, then gave a small, controlled nod. "Good luck," he said, and left. This time, he didn't come back. The room settled again, but it felt different now. Not uncertain, not divided. Moving. Caleb stepped back from the front. Coda stood slowly beside him, still steady, still there. Caleb looked down at him briefly, then back at the room, at the people, at the beginning of something he hadn't expected. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't just moving forward. He knew where he was going. The first winter came hard. Snow settled deep across the clearing, covering the old stone path in a clean, unbroken layer. The estate stood against it all, unchanged in shape, but no longer silent. Light filled its windows now, warm, steady, alive. Caleb stood at the edge of the porch, watching the early morning settle over the trees. His breath rose in slow clouds, fading into the pale sky. Behind him, the house moved, not loudly, but constantly. Footsteps, voices, the quiet rhythm of people working together. It had taken months to get there. Long days, longer nights. Repairs came first. The roof had needed more than patching. The east wall had shifted under years of pressure. The wiring had been replaced piece by piece, carefully, without disturbing what lay beneath. People came. At first, just a few. A carpenter who remembered his father speaking about the estate. A retired electrician who said he wasn't ready to sit still yet. Then more. Volunteers, neighbors, strangers who had heard something about the place and decided to see it for themselves. They didn't come for money. They came for answers. Coda moved through it all, slower now, more careful with his injured leg, but still present, still watching, still guarding. Caleb turned as the front door opened behind him. Margaret stepped out, a folder tucked under her arm, her expression steady but softer than it had been months before. "They're here," she said. Caleb nodded. "I figured." He stepped aside as a small group approached from the path. An older man led them, walking with a cane but steady in his movement. His coat was worn, his hat pulled low against the cold. He stopped a few feet from Caleb. "Name's Daniel Reed," he said. Caleb extended his hand. "Caleb Hayes." Daniel shook it firmly. My grandfather worked here, he said. At least, that's what we were told. Caleb nodded. Let's find out, he said. They moved inside together. The main hall had changed, not in structure, but in feeling. The dust was gone, the light clearer. Tables had been set up along the walls, covered with carefully organized files and photographs. Names were labeled clearly now. Records preserved, not hidden. People moved slowly through the space, reading, looking, remembering. Caleb led Daniel to one of the tables. Coda followed closely. Daniel's hands trembled slightly as he reached for a folder marked Read. He opened it, paused, then turned the first page. A photograph, black and white. A younger man stood in front of the estate, tools in hand, expression serious but steady. Daniel's breath caught. That's him, he said quietly. Caleb didn't speak. He didn't need to. Daniel turned another page. Letters. Records. A life that had been reduced to memory now written clearly in front of him. He was a carpenter, Daniel said. Fixed everything. That's what my father used to say. Caleb nodded. It's written here, he replied. Daniel smiled faintly. Then something else passed through his expression. Relief. Thank you, he said. Caleb shook his head. It wasn't mine to keep, he said. That had become the truth of it. The house didn't belong to him, not in the way people thought. It had been waiting for someone to open it, for someone to understand it. Coda shifted beside him. Caleb glanced down. The dog's eyes were softer now, still alert, but no longer searching. Caleb rested a hand on his back. You did this, he murmured. Coda didn't react, but he stayed close. Margaret stepped up beside them again. We've confirmed more names, she said. Families are starting to reach out. Caleb nodded. Good. She studied him for a moment. You've built something here, she added. Caleb looked around. At the people, at the tables, at the stories moving back into the world. It was already here, he said. I just stopped it from staying buried. Margaret smiled slightly. Not everyone would have. Caleb didn't respond, because he knew that. He stepped back outside later that afternoon. The sun had dropped lower, casting long shadows across the clearing. The snow reflected it all in quiet light. Coda followed him. They walked slowly toward the edge of the property, stopping where the trees began. The same place Caleb had stood on that first day. Only now, it felt different. Not waiting, not empty, complete. He looked back at the house. It stood the same as before, but not the same at all. Light filled it. Movement. Purpose. A place that had once held silence now held voices again. Coda settled beside him. Careful, steady. Caleb sat down next to him, the cold ground pressing through his jacket. He didn't mind. Not anymore. A year ago, he had nothing. No home. No direction. Just a road and a dog who refused to leave him behind. Now, he had something else, not money, not wealth, something quieter, stronger, a place that meant something, to him and to others. He reached over and scratched behind Coda's ear. Good work, he said softly. Coda closed his eyes briefly. Content. Caleb looked out toward the trees one last time, then back at the house. A home wasn't something you held onto. It was something you gave. And for the first time, Caleb Hayes wasn't trying to survive the next day. He was building something that would last beyond it. If you believe doing the right thing matters more than taking the easy money, type yes in the comments. I'd like to know where you stand. And if stories about standing your ground and doing what's right mean something to you, stick around and subscribe. There's more ahead.